here, and today we're going to start on part 3 of our inventory system. So just as a quick recap, part 1 we went over setting up the actual U object that we'll be using to store our object data inside, and then for part 2 we went through and created a world item to represent that data when it's in the world. Now for part 3, I was hoping today to go over actually setting up the inventory system itself and having these items get placed into that inventory system. So let's go ahead and get started. So from the last episode, we have these world items that we have got placed in the level. So what I was thinking is, because we don't have any sort of interaction system or anything like that in this particular project, with us starting from a blank third-person template, I was thinking of just having it where when the player overlaps with one of these items, it'll then just pick it up, and that's when it'll get added to the inventory. So what I'm going to do now, inside the inventory system folder, I'm going to go start and go ahead and create a blueprint class. And for the actual type, I want to choose actor component. I'm just going to go ahead and call this one inventory system, just like so. So the inventory system itself, this is what's going to contain the logic for adding and removing items, and it's going to be the main place where the items themselves are stored. So as a part of that, I do want to go ahead and just drop that component onto the third person character. Now, depending on the sort of game that you're making, you may also want to possibly consider putting this onto maybe the player controller or maybe even the player state, depending on the sort of game that you're making. You just have to be aware as to where it is that it's stored, so it's a bit easier to get it from when you need it. Generally though, the player characters tends to be the easiest to sort of handle and keep track of. And the reason why is because when we start looking at things like inventory containers, so things like chests, barrels, drawers, anything that would possibly contain an item that isn't something like a player character, the component itself would be on the actor. So having it on the actor for everything does sort of simplify things a little bit, because you're not having to check, is it the player character, is it not the player character? So it's a little bit easier, that way, regardless of what it is. If it has an inventory system, it's going to be on the sort of the main actor. But like I said, depending on the sort of game you're making, you might not always want to do that. Okay, so with that done, we've got that placed onto the third person character. We can go ahead and just open up that component, so the inventory system. I'm just going to delete these two nodes to start with. The first thing we need to do before we can do anything else really is create the variable that's going to store our items in our inventory. So I'm going to go ahead and start to the variables section and start a new variable. I'm going to go ahead and call this one items. And this wants to be of type item base. So it's going to be the same type as the U object that we created. And we do want that to be an object-based reference. For the sort of container type, for the variable, there's kind of a few options you've got here. For what we're doing, we're probably just going to use possibly either a set or an array. But if, for example, you didn't want the quantity to be inside the base, so you're going for more of like a data asset approach, you could do it where it's more of a map where the integer or possibly even a structure, if you want a few additional bits of information to be sort of attached to it, the integer itself could denote the number of that specific item that you have. For what we're going to do, I'm trying to think, I'm going to go ahead and do a set. And the reason I'm going to use a set is because we can convert to an array, like so. So if we ever need to loop through it, we can do that. But the set itself, it has kind of like a built-in system that prevents it from having duplicates, which in itself can be quite useful. Of course, with it being a set, it does mean that the order isn't maintained in any sort of shape. Generally, the order is the order they're added in. If the order is important for you, then you may want to choose an array. But again, it's kind of up to you how it is that you want to handle it at this particular point. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is start actually creating some functions that we can some functions that we can call to start adding some of these item objects into this variable that we have here. So the first one I'm going to do is create a function called add item object. And for this one, it's going to be fairly straightforward. Just a simple add to the set, and we'll just add a variable in there. So that's going to be a new item. Just like so. So that itself is just going to add the item object as is. So at the moment it's not doing any additional checks or anything like that. So the next one I want to do is, I'm just going to add another one, and this one's going to be called add item. So these are going to be kind of similar in a sense. So you can think of add item as kind of being, well, add item objects is kind of like a forceful way of just adding the item object that you're inputting into it. The add item is going to be a little bit more refined in the sense that it's actually going to do some checks to see, does the item type that we're trying to add already exist within our items list? If it does, then we can look at adding the quantity to the one that we currently have. So we've done the add item, so the first thing we need to do is actually then do a check. So we can get the items array and we can convert that to an array. And this then just allows us to loop through those specific items. And I'm going to go ahead and do a for each loop on that. Just before I go any further in this particular section, I'm just going to select these nodes and just collapse to a function. I'm just going to call this one find item object by type. So we do need an input on this particular function, and this needs to be the item base, and that needs to be of type of a class reference. So I do item type. That's so. So when we actually call that variable, we'll be able to pick the type of class that we want. So with that done, from the for each loop, we can run through and get class. And then we can do a check to see if that is equal to the item type that we're passing into the function. So do a branch. Like so. And then if that's true, we can just do a return node. So, and we'll just pass the array element. So when we actually return within a function, if there is a for loop in it, it'll just stop the for loop essentially. So this function will stop the moment the return value is called. Now, if it is able to make it all the way to the last element and it's not valid, it doesn't find the right class, we can just do a return, and that'll just be a null return essentially. I'm just going to rename that to item object. So that's the function setup there. Now you kind of got two choices you can kind of do with this particular one. Is you can leave it as an impure node, so that's where you have to pass an execution line through it, or alternatively you could have it as a pure, where it does it like this. Now just remember, if it is a pure function, whenever it has a connection, it'll always essentially call that function again, so it'll have to go through the loop again. So depending on the size of your inventories and things like that, you might want to leave it as an impure node, just so it's not having to keep looping through, and it'll just cache the value. If you are manipulating values in the inventory, having a pure version might be useful. Again, it's kind of one of those things that you might have to just bear in mind as you are developing your specific system, as you might need to go through and update accordingly depending on the sorts of things that you're doing. So going back to the add item, where we've got this find item object by type, we can go ahead and add a new input to that. And that's going to be the item base of the object type reference. And what we want to do is do the get class, and we want to pass that into the find item object by type. So what we can then do is do a quick is valid on the return value. So if it's not valid, we can go ahead and just add the item object. So if you remember, the add item object just adds it straight to the set that we have. If it is valid, what we want to then do is actually modify the element, the actual object itself. So we can do, so we've not set those up yet. Okay, so I believe on the last episode we did do the set quantity function, which we added to the item object base. So we could, if we wanted to, we could set up some logic in here that would sort of handle that. But what I'm going to do is actually create a function inside the item base itself, specifically for modifying the quantity. So we're going to do add a new function. So this is inside the item base. I'm going to call this one modify quantity. Now, just as a reminder, the quantity value is a private value, so we don't have direct access to this value anyway. So we have to use one of these kind of like setter functions. Now, I am still going to use the set quantity function. The only difference is we're going to be adding a value to it, and then we'll be passing that in. That's so, and we'll just do change the input there to amount. Now, if we go back to the inventory system, instead of calling the set quantity function, we can call the modify quantity function. That's so. Now, again, in this example, I've just used a single modify quantity function. In your own, you might want to have add and remove items as two separate functions. Again, it's completely up to you how you want to do that. With the modify quantity, we can just provide it with a negative value, and that'll reduce it. But again, depending on the sorts of things that you're going to be doing, that's not always the best way to handle it. So again, you can choose which option you think is going to best fit your specific project. Once we've done that, we can get the item object we're passing in. So that's what this is here. We can do the get quantity, and we can pass that into the amount. So we essentially want to add the amount. Now, for what we're doing here, I'm not dealing with any kind of max stack sizes or anything like that. But if you are, you may have to do some additional checks and things like that to determine when and how much should be added. The next thing I'm going to do is just do a return value on here. This return value is probably going to be more applicable for if you do have stat limits and things like that, or even just limits on how many items you can have in the inventory system itself. And that's just a return value for return value, and that's just to denote, did we successfully add the item to the inventory. So for these two here, that would be true, so that'd be successful. Now, just so we can kind of see that in action a little bit more, what I am going to do is actually add an additional variable to this inventory system. I'm just going to call that max items, and that's just going to be a type of integer. It's going to be a single. And this just is going to be the maximum amount of items that could ever exist in this single inventory system. So I'll go ahead and set that to 10 for now. So what we can actually do with this is, there's kind of two ways. You can kind of think of it as the max unique items or the max total quantity of items. For this, I'm just going to do it as max unique items. So essentially 10 item objects in this specific value. So what we can actually do is get in the items set and get the length. And just check if the length is less than the max items. And do a branch, and we just want to squeeze that in between the is not valid and the add item. So in this instance, if it finds an item of that type, then it can go and just pop it in. If it doesn't, it'll then check, well, can we fit another item object within our inventory? And if we can, it adds the item. If it doesn't, it'll fail, so we can return false on that specific one. So that's kind of like how you would use the return value on that. Okay, so at this point, we're probably getting ready to possibly be able to actually set up some logic in the item, so the world item itself. So I'm going to go ahead and open the world item up now, and I'm going to jump to the event graph. So from if we right click on the item mesh in the components tab section, we can add an event and use the begin overlap. So when something overlaps with this, we'll get the other actor, and that'll be the thing that's overlapped with it. Now, when it comes to kind of like overlaps and things like that, anything can overlap something else, depending on how you've set up the collision on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cast to pawn from the other, and this just checks to make sure that the thing that's overlapped this item is a character of some sort. So this could even be an NPC if you wanted to. So if you have an NPC that has an inventory component on it, in theory, if they run over walk over the item and overlap it, they themselves can also pick it up. Whether or not you want that, this is kind of where you can tailor some of that specific logic. Okay, so in this case, as I mentioned, we're just checking to see if it's the pawn. Well, any pawn. If you want it to be only for the player character, you can cast to, in this example, the third person character. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, I don't want to be casting. Generally, if it's going to be loaded anyway, you don't need to worry about it. You're not going to save anything from not casting to it. So in this case, because we only have one character, and it's the third person character, that character is always going to be loaded when we're controlled by the player. So not casting to it means we're going to end up having to set up additional checks and things like that, interfaces, which is actually going to be more resource intensive than had we just cast. Okay, so they're just the two sort of options that you've got there. Now, from the return value that it gives, I'm going to go ahead and use the get component by class. So if you follow some of my other videos, you might have seen me use this now a few times. And for the component type, we want to use the infantry system. So what this is going to do is the target that we input into it, it's going to check every single component that it has until it finds the infantry system component. So you kind of think of it as just going down the list of components until it finds the one it wants. If it gets to the end, then it'll just return an invalid option here. So because it can be invalid, we are going to use an isValid node on that, just to make sure that we don't attempt to do anything on the inventory system until, unless it's actually a valid reference that we've got. So assuming it is valid, we can then just call the add item function. Like so. And what we want to do is pass in the item object that we have. Now, it may be worth just doing a quick isValid check on that as well. In most cases, that's probably going to be valid anyway, but there might be some instances where it isn't, and that's just going to mess things up essentially if it's not valid. So if we pop that check in first, then we know that less things are going to break. We'll get to this point. So at the moment, when we overlap, assuming it's the player, we then want to check, was it able to successfully add the item to the inventory? Now, if it was, we can kind of just destroy the actor. And if it wasn't, then we don't want to do anything. Just like so. So we can go ahead and actually just check to see if that's working. So if we go ahead and jump in and play, in theory these items should destroy themselves when we overlap them. If they could be overlapped. So 1 second. So on the item mesh, we do just need to adjust the collision on those to make sure that so the Under the collision settings, want to go down to the collision presets, set that to custom. So it should keep the same settings that it already had. So at the moment it looks like they're all set to block. But on the pawn, I just want to set that to overlap. Now if we check it, there we go. So one of those items has disappeared, so there's that one. And then finally the third one. And we can check to see if it's actually successfully added them. So if we go to the infantry system component, for the debug tab we should see one listed. If you have multiple infantry systems in your level already, then they'll probably appear in here as well. But if you find the one that's on the third person character, we can start looking at some of the data that's on in that set. So you can see there's now 3 items in there. So these items are stored within the infantry system. Okay. That's so. So what I was kind of thinking is possibly just adding a quick function that would drop an item. So what we can do, I'm just going to go ahead and create a new action. Input action. I'm just going to call this one drop item. I'm just going to make this just drop the first item that's in the inventory that it sort of comes to. So nothing fancy. Just need to make sure I do add that to the input mapping context and specify a key. So I'm just going to go ahead and set it to Q. And then if we open up the third person character, we can add the item drop input action. And what we want to do is call a function on the infantry system when this is triggered. That function though at the moment doesn't exist, so we're going to go ahead and go back to the infantry system component, and this time I'm going to create a new function called drop item. And what drop item is going to be responsible for is spawning in that world item into the world and passing the object to it and then removing it from the infantry system itself. So the first thing we want to do is let's add in a spawn actor of class node. I want to do that as world item. Now world item does take the item object. Now I'm going to go ahead and actually plug that in as an input, so that way this function could be kind of reused in other settings. But I'm going to set it up so there's going to be an additional function that will always drop the first one. Now with this spawn actor function, we do need to specify the transform, so at least a location. So we can just split it if we wanted to, but that's going to make it spawn the item at 0, 0 essentially, which isn't obviously what we want. Now if we get the owner of this component, we can get the world location of that if we wanted to, and we can plug that in. Now what I'm going to do is get the forward vector. So, and then I'm going to multiply that by a distance. So I'll do that as 150, so you can think that's 1.5 meters. And then we do need to add that to the world location of the actor, so we use the get actor location for that. And then we just want to add these two values together. So the forward vector, that's just the direction that the actor is facing, kind of like normalized. So you can think of it as kind of like the rotation value, and then we multiply it by the distance to move it away from in that given direction, and then we add the new value to the starting one, so we can kind of plug that in. So that way when we drop the item, it's always going to be in front of the player essentially. World item. So I've just, instead of having a pin come across for the lines, I've just got the variable version of the input, just to tidy things up a bit. So when you are using these inputs, these variables, it's like when I did the item object, there was a few options that popped up. So we don't want to get the one from the world item, we want to make sure we're getting the one from the infantry system, which is kind of what refers to this one here, the input. Okay, now for the collision handling, this itself is probably just as important as well. Now, depending on what the project settings are, it may spawn, well, it might always spawn and just be ignored, but there are other options that you can go for. So I'm going to go for try to adjust location but always spawn. So that way, this particular location itself might not always be the best one, but it will try and adjust it where it can, so it'll kind of move the location a little bit so it's not colliding with anything. Now, of course, it's not perfect, but it might be sufficient enough for the sorts of things that you're wanting to do. Now, in most cases, this shouldn't fail, but I'm just going to do an isValid node on that anyway, just to make sure that it has successfully spawned this item in. And if it has, we can then remove the inputted item object, because we have already passed that to the world item, so it should now exist in here. If we didn't remove it from the items here as well, then it would exist in 2 places, which obviously we don't want to do. Just for clarity, it is something where you can actually have the item object reference in multiple places, and it will, and both those 2 places can manipulate the values at the same time, because it's still the same object, it's just being referenced in 2 places. Okay, so in terms of removing this, we probably do want to have a specific function for that, but I'm not going to do one just yet. So I'm just going to leave this as a simple remove function and just pass in the item object that we want to remove. Just like so, and again I'm just going to do a return value, and I'm just going to do a quick check there and just return the value of the drop so we know if it's successfully dropped the item. If it's not valid, then we can do a return value of null, false on that particular one. So I'm just going to create a new function now. I'm just going to call this one drop first item. And for this, I'm going to convert that to an array and get copy. We could call that drop item function. And again, we're going to add the return value as well, just so if this is ever called, we know if it's successfully dropped that item. Okay, so now if we go back to the third person character blueprint, what we can do is pull from the infantry system and we can call that drop first item function. And we want to call that on the started. Now, if we go ahead and test it, we pick up some items and then press Q, nothing happens. Okay, so let's do a quick debug, see what's happening here. So I'm just going to add a breakpoint to this particular function, and what that means is when any point during the logic it gets to this node, it kind of like pauses the game and it allows you to sort of step through the nodes. So let's go ahead and do that. So first let's pick some items up and then I'll press Q. Okay, so it is getting to the function. So what we can then do up here, we can click the advance a single frame and it kind of starts stepping through, so we can see what's happening here. Okay, so that's okay. So it is getting the item there. Okay, so we are now currently in the item. Okay. So in the construction script, okay, so chances are it probably is spawning the item, but we currently have an issue where in the world item itself in the construction script, which is where we do these checks that actually set up the items, it doesn't get any further. So we kind of got two choices here. We can either just remove the item type on the construction script, which I myself am not going to do. So what I'm going to do on the item, on the main event graph, we want to add the event to begin play. And if the item quantity is valid, so I'll just convert that to a validated get. Actually, no, we don't need to do that because we do the check already. So I'm just going to do just call the update item mesh. So that's this function here. So if, as you can see, we already do that check anyway. So we just call it straight off the bat. Now if we give it a try, I'm just going to remove that breakpoint. You can see it's now dropping the item. So what we can do, if you remember in the previous episode I did mention that there might be instances where you want this to actually be a physics object where it falls. So what we can do with the item mesh selected, what we can do is enable simulate physics. Now because we don't actually have a mesh selected, it's not going to let us do that. So what we can do up here where we set the static mesh, if it was able to successfully do that, we can enable physics. Well, so this is set simulate physics, and we can set that to true. So now you can see the items will fall down. Like so. And there we go. We can pick those up and move them about. Now, at this particular stage, obviously you've got quite a lot of flexibility in terms of the things you can do already. For example, the drop items. At the moment, all we're doing is just getting a point in front of the player at a specific distance. You could get a bit more elaborate with how you do these checks. You could do some line trace if you wanted to, and things like that, to get a more applicable sort of spot to drop the item if you wanted. Again, obviously all we're doing here is just getting the first item and dropping it. Later on, we possibly use that drop item function to be a bit more specific when we have some UI elements and things like that. Okay, so yeah, so at this particular point, I think I want to go ahead and leave this particular part here. So already what we've got now is the ability to actually add items to an inventory, as well as just being able to drop, in this case, just the first item to it. Okay. So again, just want to say thanks again for watching, and if you've not already subscribed, go ahead and do that. I will try and do some additional videos, sort of adding new features and things to this, and hopefully at some point get to the UI side of things, show you how you can show those items. So do subscribe so you don't miss that. I do have a Discord as well, so if you want to join the conversations that we have over there, by all means jump on there. Also, I do have a lo-fi page, so if you do want to support me financially, there is an option on there to do so. Obviously it is completely optional, just so you are aware, but obviously if you do want to, that is an option. Again, thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Hopefully you find it useful, and I just want to say thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.